Hello and welcome to Part 5 of Ontario Regulation 299-10 training video. In this final segment on Part 5 of the regulations, our focus is on the quality assurance measures for the application entities. Quality assurance measures specific to application entities will come into effect on July 1st, 2011. There are 7 key quality assurance measures. One is the promotion of social inclusion, individual choice, independence, and rights. The second is abuse prevention and reporting, including a review of policies and procedures on abuse. Third is notification of incidents of abuse. Fourth is confidentiality and privacy. Fifth is safety around premises owned and operated by agency and the application entity. Sixth are human resources practices for staff and volunteer training and board orientation. And seventh is record keeping concerning person with a developmental disability. Let's go through the requirements to achieve each of these quality assurance measures. Application entities will focus on social inclusion, individual choice, independence, and rights by having policies and procedures must contain a mission statement that promotes the social inclusion, independence, and rights of persons with developmental disabilities. A mission statement outlines the application entity's values and principles. A written statement that provides the service principles, philosophy, and approaches to service delivery. A written statement that outlines the rights of persons with developmental disabilities who have applied for services and supports and is based on respect for and the dignity of the person. Application entities will provide a mandatory orientation to the mission statement, service principles, and statement of rights with new staff members, new volunteers, and new members of your board of directors. An annual refresher for staff and volunteers on the mission statement, service principles, and statement of rights is also a requirement. Ensure that your board of directors conducts an annual review of the mission, principles, and statement of rights, including any updates. Keep a record of all orientations, refreshers, and reviews. Application entities will provide information to persons with developmental disabilities in order that each person can make informed decisions, including the consideration of risks. This will be demonstrated by the persons exercising their right to self-determination regarding activities in their individual support plan and participation in community activities such as work, recreation, social, cultural, and religious events. Application entities will have policies and procedures to respond to the disclosure of abuse or suspected or witnessed abuse. To ensure that each person is supported in a safe and respectful environment where abuse will not be tolerated and where all incidents of abuse and any suspicions of abuse are reported immediately to the police and action is taken. All policies and procedures on abuse must promote zero tolerance toward all forms of abuse. Application entities must document and report any alleged, suspected, or witnessed incidents of abuse of persons with developmental disabilities. The report should include the method of support for a person with a developmental disability in response to the abuse. Application entities will have policies and procedures to deal with staff members and volunteers who have abused or are alleged to have abused persons with developmental disabilities who have applied for services and supports. Application entities are required to provide mandatory training and an annual refresher course on abuse prevention, identification, and reporting to all of its staff and volunteers who have direct contact with persons with developmental disabilities. A mandatory orientation to all new members of the board of directors and an annual refresher is required on policies and procedures on abuse prevention, identification, and reporting. A mandatory annual review must be conducted of the policies and procedures on abuse to assess their effectiveness. An assessment of the policies and procedures is required to prevent occurrences of abuse. You must promptly update and implement the changes that are determined necessary as a result of the review. And a written record of the review and any changes must be maintained. The application entity will ensure all abuse will be immediately and directly reported to the police. An internal investigation will not be initiated by the application entity until the police have completed their investigation. Policies and procedures must state that the police must be called first. They must also state that after police are informed, consent must be given by the person with a developmental disability before informing other people about the abuse, including the person's family. If the person wants to tell someone else, then it's that person's decision. In a situation where the individual with a developmental disability is incapable, then the substitute decision maker or another person acting on their behalf should be informed. All abuse, whether criminal or not, must be reported to the ministry as a serious occurrence. To protect the personal information of persons applying for services and supports, the application entity will have policies and procedures on consent and on how personal information will be collected, used, and disclosed to ensure compliance with applicable privacy legislation and its privacy and confidentiality obligations under any funding agreement made under the Act. To ensure that persons applying for services and supports understand, a review of the policies and procedures on consent, confidentiality, and privacy with the person with a developmental disability and those acting on their behalf will be conducted. The review must be appropriate to their level of support and capacity. Training of staff and volunteers and an orientation for board of directors regarding your policies and procedures on privacy, confidentiality, and consent is required. To demonstrate compliance, such training and orientations can be documented in personnel files and board minutes. Application entities must meet all provincial and municipal requirements, including fire and health and safety regulations. Application entities will consider different types of emergency situations and articulate the appropriate means to respond. This includes an approved fire safety plan, an emergency preparedness, and a plan to address situations where there is a service disruption. Application entities must have policies and procedures to include these plans and provide training for staff. All entity-operated premises must have an approved fire safety plan for each premise. A request can be made to an application entity to produce its approved fire safety plan. Compliance with the regulation requires a fire safety plan that is signed off by the local municipal fire department. Application entities must have an emergency preparedness plan for emergency situations that may occur inside the premises. This could include power outages, fire, flood, storm damage, pandemic, and medical emergencies. Also, application entities will develop an emergency preparedness plan for emergency situations that occur outside the premises, such as the person runs away or becomes lost. Staff must receive training in the procedures outlined in the emergency preparedness plan. A continuity operational plan will ensure safety around the application entity premises during a service disruption. A service disruption is a situation that prevents you from continuing to operate your business either in your regular location or in its usual way. Application entities will ensure that all equipment used or around the premises is maintained as directed by the manufacturer. Policies and procedures are necessary regarding the maintenance of equipment and shall include maintenance recommendations by the manufacturer. Documentation will be needed to indicate that equipment is maintained or inspected as required. This could include fire extinguishers, sprinkler and alarm systems, mechanical lifts and elevators, heating and cooling equipment. Application entities would also need to keep their smoke detectors, carbon monoxide detectors, and fire extinguishers in good working order. All staff members and volunteers must receive an orientation and training on the application entity's policies and procedures and their role in working with persons with developmental disabilities. Application entities will document the date of the orientation and any future training on providing support to persons with developmental disabilities. Documentation should be maintained in the staff member's current personnel file. To be proactive in the recruitment process and assess a potential employee's and/or volunteer's suitability for working with persons with developmental disabilities, a personal reference check and police records check must be completed for each staff or volunteer before commencing work. Confirmation must be maintained in the personnel file. A police records check is a record of a person's involvement with the police obtained through a search of police databases and includes a review of the vulnerable sector screen. A personal reference check and police records check will be completed for volunteers and board members if they have direct contact with the persons with developmental disabilities. Application entities will have written protocols with local police services to ensure the type of information provided through a police record check is appropriate to the position being applied for. The personal reference check and police records check are completed as soon as possible for the new staff member, volunteer, or board member before or after they assume their responsibilities. Until the completion of the reference check and police records check and their orientation and initial training, a staff member, volunteer, or board member shall have direct contact with persons with a developmental disability only when being supervised. Application entities will consider its record-keeping practices and maintain a record for each person's applying for services, which will include a copy of the person's application for developmental services and supports intensity scale needs assessment, an individual support plan. Application entities will have policies and procedures on service record retention and secure storage. The person's service record will be retained for a minimum of 7 years after the person's initial assessment. That concludes training on Part 5, Quality Assurance Measures for Application Entities. Thank you.